Hello and welcome to Lady Dynamite Creates. This is Tiffany and today I'm going to show you how I created Captain Mazie Deepwater, the mermaid pirate. I decided I wanted to squeeze out another mermaid for Mermay this year, and I knew if I was going to do that I needed to use one of the pre-existing mermaid dolls that I had. However, I knew most of my mermaid dolls were missing limbs, thus the birthing of the hook-handed mermaid pirate idea. My mood board for this basically consisted of pirate tropes. Tricorn hats, cutlasses, hook hands, treasure maps and chests, just the typical things that you would see with a pirate. And I did want to keep her color palette very neutral. I wanted her shirt to be very flowy with a leather belted underbust corset. So once I had lots of design ideas banging around in my head, I decided to get to work. I decided to go with Sirena as my base doll, but that was only because she was the only one that had a traditional mermaid tail in my collection. I've given her a Cleo arm to be used as her hook hand so it'll look like a wood base, and I do swap out this gray one later on for her original arm just because this was a reboot arm, so the peg was too large to fit in the hole. Now I can move on to getting her prep, and I shave down her hair with my electric razor. I place her head first down into some boiling hot water, and this is going to soften up the vinyl so that the head is easily pulled off the net peg without damaging it. Once it's had a chance to sit and get soft, it easily pops right off. I use a flathead screwdriver to loosen up the glue and the hair plugs. I slide it in through the neck hole and I gently scrape down the inside surface where the hair plugs and glue are. Once it's been loosened, I can use my needle nose pliers to pull out all of the gross glue bits and hair chunks. Using 100% acetone and cotton balls, I can remove her factory paint. It should be noted that this can only be used on the vinyl of the head. If you try to use 100% acetone or nail polish that contains acetone on the body, it'll start to melt the plastic. So try to use non-acetone nail polish remover for that stuff. I prepare her scalp for rerooting with a few coats of brown acrylic paint. This is so if there's any thinner spots in your reroot, it won't be as noticeable because you won't see the white of the scalp through. It'll blend in with the hair more. Rebecca over at Beck's Mini Studios sent me this yarn, and I have to say it's absolutely gorgeous and it's so super soft, and I love the chunky nature of it. I unwind all the strands to prep it for rerooting. However, these strands are still really chunky and are too thick to actually reroot one at a time. Each strand winds up getting pulled apart several times to reroot with, so I wind up taking about 3 or 4 portions off each one. To reroot it, I drape that section over my finger and then slide it onto the needle tool and plunge it down into the head. I only reroot about every other hole on the hairline and the part line, and about every 3 or 4 holes when I'm filling in the majority of the scalp. Since I'm rerooting down the center of the piece of yarn, when I go to do the part line, I simply plug it down into the holes, and I can take either ends of that yarn plug and pull them down to the left and the right side, and this is going to create a nice neat part. Finally, with the reroot complete, I can seal all those plugs in place with some liquid fusion glue. I just squeeze some down into the neck hole, and then I rub my silicone tool around in there, making sure that I'm touching all of those plugs. We want to make sure they're nice and secure. Now let's get started on her clothes. I begin by sewing gathering threads along the top and the bottom edge of the main portion of the bodice. Once they're gathered, we're going to be attaching them to this bottom band. A gathering thread is just the longest stitch on your sewing machine, and you're making sure not to do a forward and back stitch at the very beginning and the end. We're going to leave those threads loose. With them sewn in place, I can start doing the gathering, and first I tie off the ends on the opposite side, and I'm going to pull the 2 threads that are on the same side of the fabric to gather up that line, and I'm gathering it up to the same length of the bottom band. I will recommend that if you are sewing something to be gathered, to sew down 2 rows of the gathering threads. When you're only sewing down 1 row, it has a tendency to twirl around the thread when you're gathering it, and having the 2 rows there does help it to not do that as badly, but I know sometimes you're working on doll scale, you just don't have the room. With that gathered, I sew the bottom band to the main portion of the bodice with the right side spacing, and this will set those gathers in place. I use my seam ripper to remove all of the gathering threads. Now I pull on the gathering threads at the top and make that the same width as the bottom. I make sure to evenly disperse the gathering. Once I have it to the right shape, I'm going to stitch that down. I very carefully remove those gathering threads as well. I use Velcro to create a closure for the back. Now I take my super long rectangle, which is going to be the top ruffle for the bodice, and I'm going to sew 2 gathering threads along the top of this. I gather it to the width of the bodice, and I'm making sure to leave areas for the armholes, and I pin this in place, and then I'm going to top stitch this down, making sure to not run over those armholes. Now for the underbust corset. I'm going to be sewing this out of some fake pleather, but I do want to retain some stretch to it, so I'm going to cut my pieces out on the biased, which means I'm cutting the pieces out on the diagonal of the fabric. So I'm making sure when I'm laying out my pattern pieces that the threads are not running up and down, but they're going diagonally across the fabric. Before I attach my side pieces, I'm going to add in my decorative belts and buckles. I have these adorable tiny little belt buckles, and I'm going to just slide pieces of leather into these and then tack them in place before I can sew the side edges. I temporarily tack them in place with a little dot of super glue. With right sides facing, I attach the center front to the side seams, and then I attach the 2 back portions as well. Now to add some details. I'm going to be using some gem tack glue to attach some nail art decorations. I prefer to use the gem tack when I'm applying things that might be visible onto clothing because it dries clear and it's less noticeable if it squeezes out a little bit around the edges. I'm not going to be applying any kind of hooks or closures on this. I'm going to be sewing this directly onto the doll. It won't be permanently affixed. You will be able to untie it and take it back off, but I'm just going to be stitching it in place with some embroidery floss and tying it in a bow. And I will 100% admit is because I hate eyelets. Can't tell you how many outfits I've completely destroyed putting eyelets on at the very end. If you've got any tips or recommendations to make eyelets go smoother, leave a comment because I need to know. Now for that hook hand. I take the Clio arm and I'm going to just shave off portions of the plastic, and I'm making it look kind of whittled. In the end, it wound up being pointless because I covered it anyway, but I wanted it to have the whittled wooden look. For the hook itself, I'm taking a bit of aluminum wire and I need to sand it down to be the same thickness as the peg for a hand. I don't want to secure this in place with glue. I still want it to be able to rotate and pose with it, so I'm going to try to imitate and shave out the shape for the peg. Once it fits, I'm going to curl out the shape of the hook. I snip away the excess and then I start filing that into a point. Now I can begin to add some of the decorative bits here. I'm just adding pieces of brass tubing and filigree and leather straps and stuff. I really had no direction in mind, so I was just playing with all the pieces until I got something that I was happy with. I really wish I could have had the strapping attached to her upper arm like a traditional prosthetic would attach, but I knew if I did that I would be sacrificing the movement of the joint there, and I did want to keep that. What's a pirate captain without her hat? So I'm taking 2mm craft foam and I'm heating it up and pulling it down over my mannequin's head. I make sure my mannequin has some hair so the hat will still fit the rooted doll. I use a hair tie to hold it in place so that I can gently pull out any of the wrinkles and form it into a dome for the base of the hat. I periodically will heat up the foam again just to keep it nice and pliable and stretchy. Once the foam's had a chance to completely cool down, I'm going to remove the hair tie and I'm going to mark with a Sharpie where I would like the edge of the hat to sit. I pop it off my mannequin's head and then trim away that excess. I make sure to mark the front as well so I remember how it fits. For the brim of the hat, I cut out a donut with the center hole being the same diameter as the Monster High head. I cut small short tabs onto the inner circle. I heat up the inner circle and I begin to fold those tabs upward. I glue a 1 centimeter strip of foam around the edge of the crown of the hat. I'm making sure that the bottom edge of the crown is only hitting halfway down that strip. Now I'm going to tuck in that brim and glue it to the underside of that strip too. With the brim now attached, we can start giving it its signature tricorn shape. I'm just pulling up 3 of the sides and I'm going to tack those in place with some glue. I begin to add texture so that it has a worn leather look by heating up the hat and some tinfoil and pressing the tinfoil into the hot surface. This is going to leave little creases and texture so that it looks like leather. Now to add a few details, I'm going to poke some holes so that I can have some decorative stitching. Once the holes are there, I'm going to slide these thin strips of foam into them and glue them in place. And a huge thank you to all of my friends over on Patreon. All of your love and support help make these videos possible. Amber S., Angel Book Walter, Stormcrow Studios, Angelica, Jennifer Medina, OOAK Magpie, Dollicious, Angela Hendrickson, Beck's Mini Studio, Camille, Donna Magana, Kitsy. If you are interested in becoming one of my patrons, please check out the link in the description box below. I have several different tier options so that you can pick what works best for you. Now let's get this hat painted. I'm going to be doing about a bazillion coats of brown paint because the foam just absorbs the paint like crazy, so if you don't seal it, you're going to be doing a bunch of coats. Don't be like me. Be smarter than me. Prime it first. When I finally got a very solid opaque color, I'm going to start adding some color variation to this by just dry brushing on some different shades of brown. Keep in mind areas that are going to naturally collect dirt and just be darker in general, and areas that are going to get touched a lot and rubbed so that the color gets lighter. The final touch for her hat is adding in a jaunty little feather. While browsing for supplies for this gal at the craft store, I ran across this decorative box, which looked kind of like a treasure box, so of course I had to get it and fill it with some treasure. I'm using some crumpled up tin foil and I'm just hot gluing that down into the base as filler, and this will also help hide any of the bare areas so that it's still shiny because it'll look like silver. I'm coating the top of the tin foil liberally with glue, and then I'm going to pour these golden beads on top that look like gold nuggets. I pour off the excess beads, and then I patch any areas that look kind of bare. I glue in a couple of large acrylic gemstones. As I'm gluing things into place, I'm constantly opening and closing the chest. This is just to make sure that the chest will still close properly. The final thing I'm adding into her chest is a strand of pearls, some gold chain, and a Swarovski crystal. And I'm leaving these loose so that they can be used for posing later on, or just a customizing treat for her future owner. I've 3D modeled and printed her a spyglass and a pirate sword. I've made these 3D files free for all of my patrons, plus all of my Dynamite tier patrons will be receiving these printed for the month of June. Before I can get these painted, I am giving them a light sanding just to remove any of the rough areas left over from the supports. Once I'm done with all the sanding, I can get them coated in primer, and then I can spray them with their copper and silver paints. Then I begin the hand painting. Now, to really bring the piece alive, I'm going to be brushing on some dark brown paint, and I'm brushing this on any of the areas that have creases in them or areas that would just get a little bit more gunky. And then the most important part of this is you make sure you're completely out of focus. That's very important. And here they are completely painted, and I am really happy with how these came out. They turned out so cute, and the brushing on of that dark color really does make a difference. Now to get started on our bag, I've cut out a front piece, a back piece that has the front flat fold over, and a gusset. This pattern is available for my patrons, and it's a pretty easy one to follow. I take the gusset and the front piece with wrong sides facing and start pinning those together starting at the center point. I'm doing these wrong sides facing because I want that raw edge seam for a more rustic look, but it can be flipped right side out if you prefer. Now with those two pieces pinned in place, I can begin to sew them together. I'm going to be stitching very carefully using a straight stitch. Take care around the curves and make sure you're going slowly, and gradually lift and shift the presser foot so that it gets a nice smooth curve. I make sure to keep my seam allowance very even because this stitching is going to be visible. Now I can add in the back panel with the front flap, and I'm going to be sewing this on in the same way. However, I am going to be stopping just short, making sure that my stitching is even with the edge of the front panel. Since my seams are visible, I am cleaning them up with my scissors just to make sure they're nice and even. I trim off the excess length on the gusset to make way for loops for the straps. I slide those pieces through the jump rings and then I'm gluing them in place. Since I want my bag to be a fully functional bag, I'm adding in a snap button. I'm gluing on a piece of leather for the strapping for the bag. One side is going to be looped in normal and the other side is actually going to be attached to a clasp so that it can hook on and off and make the bag easier to come off the doll. I used some gem tight glue to begin to decorate the bag with some nail art deco bits. I am so ready for summer to be here, and something you don't realize when you're a kid is your mom wants summer to get here just as badly as you do, because she is tired of getting up at the butt crack of dawn to get you up and ready for school. I just want to sleep in. I really want to take a vacation this year too. 2 years of California restrictions, and our family really needs to just be able to go and do something fun. I use a fabric marker to darken up the visible raw edges so that they look more like real leather and not the fake stuff. To fill the bag, I've printed some clip art treasure maps, and I'm going to make these look a bit more worn and used by burning the edges and then rubbing an X-Acto blade along the edge to give a torn look. I get these rolled up and stick them down in her bag. Now to prep her body, I'm going to give it a light sanding. My plan was to keep her paint job mostly intact, but sadly there was a good amount of chipping, so it did need to be sanded a bit before I could proceed. I use my airbrush to touch up the black paint. The airbrush gun that I'm using is a dual action gravity fed brush. I like the dual action better than just the regular single action airbrush because I have more control over how much paint or air is coming out at any given time. You're painting at doll scale and on plastic to boot, so I feel like it's very easy to have the paint beat up if you're too heavy handed, and I find that it's just really easy to do that with a single action brush. Once I've gotten all the black areas touched up, I begin spraying on a light dusting of gold. This is very diluted, so it's just giving a light shimmer to the surface. Now for her big pop of gold. Her tail fins have a feature where they open up so that she can stand upright, and they also have tiny holes in them so you can see the other side of the fin through one another. Because of this, I had the idea to gold leaf the inside of this so you still see pops of that gold peeking through when her tails are closed. I'm brushing on the gold leaf adhesive to the inside of the fins, and once it becomes clear, I can begin to lay on the gold leaf. I brush away any of the excess. I seal this in with Krylon gloss varnish. So shiny. I really love how the gold just shines through. It's just so pretty. Now onto the face-up. Here's all the colors that I've used, and it's mostly neutrals, but there are a couple of pops of color here and there. I'm using Rembrandt and Pan Pastels, and then for watercolor pencils I'm using Caran D'ache Supercolor, Derwent Inktense, and Faber Castell Art Grit Aquarelle pencils. And let's not forget the mica powder. The supplies I use are always listed down in the description box, but feel free to leave a comment if you have a question. The first thing I always block in is the eye shape, and this particular mold I did find challenging. I don't know if it was maybe the up-tilted nature of her eyes, but it was a little harder for me to get a good shape. There was lots and lots of edited out erasing. I add in some details to her lips and then add in her eyelid crease as well. And here is attempt number 1 on her iris placement, which I found challenging as well. There was a lot of challenging things about this face-up. I, of course, am unhappy with this and it does get erased. Once I realized that the irises were going to give me a lot of trouble too, I decided to just fill them in temporarily and try to do the eye shape on a different layer. I had trouble getting the eye shape down and I didn't want to ruin that work by trying to get the iris on the same layer. As long as you're making sure your Mr. Super Clear layers are sprayed really well, it's like saving the layer so you're not going to risk ruining work underneath it. Now I begin all the contouring on the face, and I'm just darkening up and shading around the mouth, the nose, the eyes, and the ears. This is the first time I've ever worked with a doll that has a more white base, and I was a little concerned. I didn't want her to appear gray or washed out, but the neutral tones did wind up working nicely. Doing the doll's eyeshadow is probably my absolute favorite part of the face-up process. I just wish I could do my makeup half as well as I could do hers. My eyeshadow never looks this good. Drawing on the eyes though, that's probably my least favorite part. I almost always have to draw them more than one time, so it's just a headache for me. I'm always thrilled when it comes out right the first time because I feel like that just rarely happens. Do you have a least favorite part of the face-up or just customizing the doll in general? I was still really unsure about how I liked her eye shape, so I did something that I never do, and I drew her eyebrows on the same layer as her eyeshadow. I knew I was risking ruining the eyeshadow that I've drawn on there, but I didn't want to get further in sprayer and actually have to wipe away everything. I use my pastels to brush on a general eyebrow shape, and then I start shaping them further with my eraser. When I'm happy with this shape, I begin to add in some individual hairs, and I'm doing this with 3 different colors of watercolor pencils because I want some variation to the brown there. The last thing I do on layer 1 is dust on some gold mica powder, and then I get her sealed with a coat of Mr. Super Clear before starting layer 2. I let the Mr. Super Clear layer dry for about 30 minutes before I start trying to work on it. I start trying to sketch out her iris shape again, and let's just say it's a travesty. I think I tried this 3 times and erase, and eventually I've erased so many times that the watercolor pencils just won't draw on the surface anymore, so I'm having to use my brush to paint on the watercolor pencils wet. For the most part, all of the colors that I've used on the doll have been very neutral, but since I'm going so neutral, I knew I wanted to have one really bright pop of color, and I was going to use her eyes to do that. So I picked this very turquoise aqua color. It just reminded me of like a Caribbean beach color. I knew that this would stand out really well against all of the neutral colors, and I was hoping that it would really draw you into the face. I pump up her eyeshadow just a bit more and start adding in some definition to her lips. And here I go messing with the eyes again, still just trying to reassure myself that they are in the right position, so I'm dotting in some pupils just to be sure. I add in a bit more color to the lips. I very carefully add in a light amount of color variation to the eyes. Because I painted these irises on, I'm having to be more careful with them because the pencils want to scratch off the paint. I try to have a darker ring that circles the top portion of the iris and keeping a light halo on the bottom. The last thing I do on this layer is add another dusting of mica powder. I am wanting her to be very shimmery, so I'm having to build this up on each layer. At the start of layer 3, I'm going to start adding in some of the details to the eyes, and I am having to be extremely careful because, like I said, these pencils are wanting to scrape off the underlying layers. I'm using a very tiny brush to dust on some Payne's Gray Pastel. I'm using this right up against the edge of the eyelid so that it appears that the eyelid is creating a shadow on the eye. This will give the eye a rounder appearance. Now to layer 4. I had a bit of trouble working on her mouth, and every time I was trying to apply color, the color just did not want to go down into the crevice. It kept wanting to appear open. So I thought, well, just roll with it. So I'm painting on some white to look like teeth. I start adding in her eyelashes, and I'm using my Faber Castell. The Faber Castell pencils have a much harder lead, so they're perfect for making eyelashes. Finally, I can add in her catch lights. I seal her with 3 coats of Mr. Super Clear and she's all done. I'm only going to be doing a minimal amount of styling to her hair, so I'm taking my metal chopstick and my flat iron and just lightly curling it. I lightly brushed the hair out before I started curling just to remove any of the loose fibers, but I didn't flat iron this beforehand. The yarn was just this naturally silky. The final thing left to do is just to get her dressed and accessorized. I want to thank you all so much for watching this video, and if you did like it and you enjoy the channel, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing. I love getting to read all of your comments, and they of course help out tremendously with the YouTube algorithm, so they're greatly appreciated. If you're interested, Captain Mazie Deepwater is going to be available for purchase on my Etsy store, so please check out the link in the description box. Stay tuned to the end for some final photos, and remember, always be creating!